is going to lead us in prayer before we start.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you've allowed us to gather around and study another portion of thy word. We'd ask that you would be with the teachers, give them a ready recollection of the things that they've prepared. Be with us as students to apply those things to our lives as need be. We'd ask that you would be with the sick of this congregation. Be with the ones that are going through treatments. Be with the ones that have lost loved ones in the past week or so. Give them comfort as only you can. We'd ask that you go with us through the rest of the service. Guide, guard, direct us. Give us a home with thee if we're found faithful till the end. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Eric. Okay, so we are still on fact number 2. And what we're going to do is maybe we'll finish it up, maybe we won't. But after we've finished most of this packet, then I'm going to have some extra stuff that I want to talk about, but that is not in the packet. Just because it's not the core information that we're talking about, but I think it's interesting and it helps kind of build some of the case of the reliability. And that is going to be discussing we got a lot of things going on there. That's going to be discussing what I called, I think, the incidental coincidences. So we got Spanish going and our antivirus is expired, which is not on the screen here, just there. I may be my age, but I get extremely frustrated when these tools don't do what they're supposed to be doing. Any ideas from anyone to get that off the screen?
I saw your cursor over there. Just a second, you might be able to drag it over.
It's not on the laptop at all.
It's like your second screen if you had dual screens.
Oh, gotcha. Good thing I'm flexible. Now I have to find the mouse again. Okay. There we go. So ignoring all of that, we are going to, as I said, be attempting to finish this up. I suspect it'll probably spill a little bit over into Sunday. And if the packet doesn't, the extra stuff that we're going to talk about will. So we'll be talking about some of those extra details on Sunday. There won't be anything you necessarily need to prepare because it'll be us looking at scriptures and then I'm going to ask some questions about them. And I will pass out fact number 3 on Sunday, which, as we said before, is going to be the disciples sincerely believe that they saw Jesus alive again. And that's what we'll be talking about. What we were discussing last time was the details of crucifixion according to historical consensus and comparing that to what we summarized in the Gospels and parts of the rest of the New Testament. Somebody recap for us, how did those things compare? How did what we summarized about Jesus' trial, crucifixion, and burial compare with what we saw in those historical summaries? I should call on Zach. That would be really fun. Since you haven't been here.
I'll be able to tell you.
Yeah. Jeff?
Very similar to the historic, but there were a few differences, like the body wasn't left on the cross
Right. Okay, so minus a few details that make Jesus' situation unique, we said essentially it's the same thing. What we read in the New Testament is what the rest of history says about the process of crucifixion. And the differences were, we also mentioned that Jesus got a trial, which was not always the case. He actually got multiple trials. We talked about, and now I got my short-term recall of everything that Jeff just said. Can you repeat what you said?
The body wasn't left on the cross like oftentimes.
Okay.
Oftentimes it took a long time to die and they'd break the legs if it took too long.
Okay. So we have the difference of the trial. We have the difference of Christ being taken off the cross. And this is what I was thinking of, and what sidetracked me was Jesus was buried, which is usually not what happened. As we said, usually what happened is they would leave the body to putrefy on the cross and to be eaten by scavengers, or they would throw it literally in a garbage ditch somewhere. But Jesus was buried. He seemed to have died extremely quickly compared to what most victims did. As one of these summaries says, usually it would be several days or so that they would stay up there, but Jesus was a few hours. And that was, I think, the gist of it. So there are cases that make Jesus' trial, crucifixion, and burial very unique, but they're well accounted for. Did you have your hand up, Joy? No? I thought I saw it. Somebody else over here? No. Okay. So then we started talking about, we mentioned this quickly on the bottom of page 3, why was Jesus crucified? Do you remember what, as I say here on question number 1 at the bottom of 3, it'd be helpful to consider what was said at the trials. What were the charges that were presented to Jesus at his trials in front of the Jewish Sanhedrin? Chip?
Blaspheming, saying that he's equal with God, the Son of God. And then, again, with Pilate, he was just accused of being like a king of the Jews type vigilante slash, what's the word for it? Like militant
Yeah.
person type thing.
Yeah, so we see with the Jewish trials that they ultimately said he was a blasphemer, that he threatened to destroy the temple. That was not going to fly with Pilate. He was not going to care. And so you see kind of that difference. When they come to Pilate, the charge is he's claiming to be the king of the Jews. And that is a no-no as far as the Romans say. And nobody else is king except Caesar. And so if we're looking at the historical reason, because we can add all kinds of things like the jealousy and the fact that it was prophesied that the leaders would kill him and so forth, the historical reason is that Jesus was crucified, executed, as some kind of revolutionary, which we know there's a lot more to the story there. But it's interesting to just look at what charges were actually given to him. Is there any question about that before we move to page 4? Anything that we've talked about so far with this fact that is bugging you right now? Okay. So we talked about Jesus, and again, we looked at the ancient sources as far as written materials. And so we started with saying Josephus and Tacitus and those, they said Jesus was crucified, and then we looked at the actual comparison of Jesus' crucifixion experience with what's said in the Gospels versus history. And it all matches up very well. And now I want to turn to what we talked about with the first one also, is some of the archaeological evidence. Does anybody know how much archaeological or like object evidence do we have for crucifixion? You might have been able to pick it up in the packet, but this is a kind of a recall and an application. How much evidence do we have archaeologically about crucifixion? What? Not much. Really, essentially nothing, except for what we're about to talk about. People are constructing it from what's written about it. And as we said, it was not something that people like to talk about. And so we're constructing it from some kind of phrases here and there or short descriptions. But there hasn't really been a lot of object or physical evidence of crucifixion, and that was the case until the 60s. And as we've said with a lot of these things that we've looked at, ossuaries and what we're about to talk about, the 60s were big in terms of getting archaeological digs going, and so you see a lot of discoveries there. But on the back of this packet, page number 4, says, in 1968, the remains of a young man who had been crucified were found in an ossuary discovered in Jerusalem. And what was written on the side of the ossuary, his name, Yehohanan, if that's how you say it, I don't speak Hebrew, ben Hakol. So it would be Yehohanan, son of Hakol, is what we would say. In looking at his body, it was apparent that he had been crucified, and some of those injuries, there's different injuries to the arm bones and leg bones and things. But what was really the most interesting is his foot. And this is the famous picture. I've never seen any other pictures of any other parts of his body, but this is Yehohanan's foot. And what they found in the ossuary in his body was that the crucifixion nail was still in his heel bone. And so this is what you're looking at, his heel bone, and the nail was still in there. And looking at that nail, they can tell they found, fragments of wood and things, and it matched up to what they know as far as was the case for what crosses were made out of. And so Yehohanan became the only crucifixion victim to ever be discovered to date. And so this is the only physical, evidence to see kind of what it looked like and how it was manifested. Because as we said, usually these people were just thrown away like garbage. And so this is it's really interesting, because this is the only man that we've ever found that had been crucified. Apparently, his friends or his relatives, they took him after his crucifixion and they gave him a traditional burial, which is also interesting. But what made him famous was the fact that still lodged in his heel bone was this nail from the cross. And there was a little bit of controversy as far as, well, how was he actually fastened? And it's, I think, pretty well agreed that his arms were tied and not nailed. And we saw that sometimes people were tied, sometimes they were nailed. So his arms were tied to like a T shape, lowercase, uppercase, I'm not sure if they know for sure. Tied, and then both of his feet were nailed separately to the sides of the upright pole, is what they believe happened. And you can see the end of the nail curved over a little bit. And I'll spare you the drawings of what they think this all looked like. But essentially, he was tied by his arms, and then both of his heel bones were nailed to the pole. And as I said, it's really interesting. Maybe just to me. Hopefully it is to you as well. But in looking at this and seeing that we have this kind of physical evidence, I want to look at this question on page 4. Do you think this crucifixion and his burial shed any light on Jesus' crucifixion and burial? Why would this be at all significant? Joy. They did happen. Crucifixions? Yeah.
Making it up, that Jesus crucified. It really did happen.
Yeah.
Happened to this guy.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to remember, like we said with the ossuaries or the evidence for Pilate or whatever, this doesn't prove crucifixion because we already know from the historical record that it happened. This is a different way of looking at it, different strands, but it's something that we can see and touch and feel. You'd probably get arrested if you touch that, actually, I think. But it's a different way of looking at it, and we can see, oh, wow, this was a real person, and this actually happened to them. So what else might be significant about it?
Show the gruesomeness and painfulness.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, if you take some time to think about, for one, the force that would take to put a nail through someone's heel. That would take a lot of force for one thing, not to mention everything else that happened to him. So it demonstrates how gruesome this was as we read about it. What else might be significant? Salem.
That Jesus wasn't the only, crucifixion victim to be buried, so it should, lead some credence to the fact that that wasn't accepted, or,
Did we talk about that or no? Okay, I can't remember. I'm trying to think if she's cheating or not. What she said was that this shows that Jesus was not the only crucifixion victim in history to be buried, specifically among the Jewish people. So Jesus isn't the only one. It's not this random, unique thing, but it shows here at least one other time a Jewish person who was crucified was then given a proper burial. And so that's pretty big because it shows that what we have again as the record is reliable. You know, this is not really as amazing as it seems that Jesus was buried. Of course, the details of Joseph of Arimathea are different. But Jesus was not the only person in history that was buried after crucifixion. And so that's significant. Can you think of anything else? What do you think is significant or maybe even just interesting about this? Or if you have any questions about it, I don't know if I can answer any of them, but we can give it a shot.
I would say that the odds of finding stuff from people that are crucified are really low because you got to think that they're all using iron and wood, which are the two most quick decaying materials almost that there is. So.
Yeah, so probably the only reason we have this is because it was in that bone box, that ossuary, or else it would have just disintegrated in the ditch somewhere with the rest of the material. So that's interesting. Joy?
2 questions. How long does the history say how long that bone had been there?
When this happened?
Yeah.
They do believe it was in the 1st century. The 1st century around Jerusalem.
And I can't help but wonder, even though it's just that one bone and nail, if there was not someone who might have made sure that there was one in the world.
I have no way of knowing or proving that, but that's interesting. Some kind of record. And I mean, part of it would be if you're preparing the body, I don't know if it would be God. Okay. It's interesting that a lot of these things we started to find as these kind of arguments against things were being made. That would be a whole other direction that we could go. But yeah, that we have this kind of tangible evidence, and there's a whole lot of things that are significant about this, because you might look at this and say, well, that's really cool, but I think it shows a lot of important parallels between Jesus and this situation, which we might not think about if we were just seeing this on the news or something. Had anybody heard of this before? No? I don't know. I think it became... No, I'm not going to say. That's a guess. I don't know. Somebody had their hand up over here? No? Chet? Yeah.
One big difference between Jesus and the crucifixion of this gentleman, that Jesus was never to walk on the earth to be killed again. He was taken to heaven.
Yeah.
Where anybody, we only have one other instance of a man who has risen from the dead, but he had to die again.
Right.
So Jesus was different than any of the others.
Yeah. Yahuhanan, he stayed in this box, and Jesus did not.
Right.
Jesus never made it to the box because he raised before that. Anything else we want to talk about? Questions? No?
When did you
Josh?
say this was discovered?
1968,
All right.
I believe is the date.
So, I mean, that makes me wonder if that means that if this was discovered, 1968, if there's still more that could potentially.
Oh, I can't even imagine. So part of it is they can't dig everything up because it's such a contentious area, for one thing. Also, like we talked about with the ossuaries, some of these things have existed in private collections for hundreds of years, and nobody knew they existed because they were in some rich guy's basement. And then they present them to the public, and we learn about them for the first time. So there's no telling. I mean, I think they even said with what we talked about with Caiaphas, there was already signs that somebody had robbed that grave at some point. And so there's no telling what's out there or what's still under the ground, and only time will tell.
Where that's on display.
I think this is in the Israel Antiquities Museum in Palestine, if I recall. And yeah, it's a pretty significant artifact, and I think it's got a lot of red tape around it. Where, like I said, you try to touch this, and you're probably going away for a while. Okay. Do we have any? Yeah, Greg, go ahead.
Well, as of the observation that it's an ossuary, it implies some measure of wealth in the family, at least. And with the stigma of the death, there may not be a lot of families that are willing to even prep a body and include it in the family grave. You could
Right.
have been, written off as one of the black sheep of the family, and so on. So I think finding, I was just reading on the internet that this was a construction site.
Yeah.
So they were digging a hole somewhere randomly, they weren't looking for the box. And, but there may have been other folks of higher stature that the family just said, not in my flaming line, we're not gonna
Right.
allow this to be perpetual in our family stories and so on, you can write them off. So it just makes the find one I think would be hard to replicate, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about trying to think. I don't think they know too much more about his story, but yeah, you think about what kinds of people were crucified and for what reasons, but his family still stood by him. And what that says about him and, maybe his innocence, I don't think we know exactly why he was crucified. Obviously, there can be some guesses, but yeah, there's a lot of interesting things about this. And yeah, that's usually how it happens is they're trying to build some new hotel or something like that, and they find all these things, and of course it shuts construction down for a long time, and I'm sure it makes a lot of people upset, but I'm glad that we have things like this. Do we have any questions about crucifixion or this evidence here, or anything that you're thinking about? I had some people ask me questions during the week, one of which I think is interesting. I had someone ask me, when did crucifixion stop happening? And I don't think we ever talked about that. So crucifixion was still practiced by the Romans for a while, and the one that actually stopped it was Constantine. So Constantine's a Roman emperor, and he's famous because he was the first one that converted to Christianity. And obviously because of his convictions, he stopped crucifixion, and that was in the early 300s when he was reigning. Any other questions like that? Nope. Yeah, Courtney. Oh, yeah. Yeah. This is thinking about details here. So, for instance, in the fall of Jerusalem, and Josephus talks about this because he was actually one of the military officers. The Romans took as many Jews as they could, and they crucified them all around the city on the walls of the city. And so that was part of the package, was they would do this, and it was to warn anybody in any group that would try to do the same thing. And so there were a lot of cases like that. All right. So I want to talk about some of these reflections. And I have some extra ones that are not on your paper, and that was just because I couldn't fit it and keep the paper limit down. So I was trying to make sure it wasn't too many pages. So I have some extra questions here that we'll think about. So on these reflections, with all that we've talked about, do you think it is likely that Jesus would have survived his crucifixion? What are we thinking?
Not without God's help.
Not without God's help. That's a good way to put it, yeah. Do you have some? I heard you clear your throat.
There's essentially no way. I mean, the Romans were professionals at what they did, and the soldiers would have known when he was dead. Pilate sent somebody else to verify no way all of them would have been duped into believing that he was just had passed out or was asleep.
Yeah. There was a lot of hands involved, and that would be very unlikely in that way.
Not to mention the soldier in John who pierced his
Right.
side, likely in the area of his heart with a spear.
And that's one of the details that we'll talk about too. In thinking about this, I'm preparing you for something later in the class. So thinking about these things, but yeah, putting all that together we can't say for 100%, yeah, it's absolutely impossible. But if you think about what happened at the beginning of the trials and what they would do in terms of beating and scourging and the whole parade process and physically draining them, and then the crucifixion, and essentially when they decided, okay, this guy's been there long enough, they would make sure that they were dead. But Jesus was apparently already dead. There's just, you'd have a lot of proving to do, I guess. It would be the nice way to put it. But the Romans, as Bryce said, they were professional crucifiers. Some of them, this would have been their job. And to them, Jesus was just another criminal to be killed. And so that is probably how they approached it. Did anybody have anything different that they were adding to that? Ashley?
This just goes along with that, the statement that the Romans were trying to make was, we are Rome, you are nothing. And so they just wouldn't have stood for anybody not dying when they were doing the crucifixion.
They would have communicated failure, for one
Yeah.
thing. Yeah. I would imagine if you kind of put together history and also what we see in the New Testament, if somebody lived, I'm sure that soldier would have to pay the penalty for that. What's interesting is there is one other recorded survivor of crucifixion, and Josephus actually records it. It was one of his friends. And so he begged the Romans to take his, I think it was 3 friends off of their crosses. 2 of them died. One was alive while he still came off the cross, and then he succumbed to his injuries before. But technically, then he survived crucifixion. And that's the only other person in recorded history except for Christ. That was just an interesting detail. You don't have to make anything of that. Yes?
Isn't that the reason that Jesus came to earth in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the questions I want to talk about in a minute, I want to discuss that. Let's look at number 2 first here on page 4. How do the details of this study help me to better appreciate what Jesus experienced through his trial, crucifixion, and death? And I want to make one thing clear. A lot of this is fun. A lot of this is kind of intellectual, and we can think about different things. But if all we take away from this is information, then I have failed you. Because I want us to apply this to our faith and see why it's significant. So, talking about crucifixion and historical record and archaeological evidence is great, and it can be fun for some people, but there's a point to that, and it's appreciating what happened. So how did these details help you to better appreciate what Jesus experienced? Zach?
I just look at that picture up there and automatically, and every time I think about it, I know it was not a good time for him.
Right.
There was no enjoyment out of this. To even think about having to go through that is just something that's so terrible. So to know that the whole reason that he went through those days and days and just the pain, the agony, all that stuff that we talk about was for the sole purpose of me. And that's what gives it meaning. That's why it means something to me, because I am not saved without that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Sorry, thinking about that kind of gives me the chills a little bit. But Jesus knew that this was coming too. It was no surprise. It wasn't, Jesus knew he was going to die, but it was kind of up in the air as to how it was going to happen. He predicted this. He knew it was happening. And he still willingly went through it. Somebody else, how does this help you better appreciate what Jesus experienced? I'll start calling on people. Joy?
I was thinking perspective.
And so not only did he physically experience it, but he had the weight of the world literally on his shoulders. That's huge. What did you say, Taylor?
I mean, similar to what Zach said,
Okay.
what you said doesn't move you. I don't even know what to say then. And I'd also read somewhere that with him being a carpenter by trade, that he's probably in pretty good physical shape.
Yeah.
And just moving around a lot. So
He was a rugged guy. Out in the wilderness, carpenter, yeah.
yeah, so to think of how much that would break somebody,
Yeah.
being in good physical shape.
He was probably in his 30s too. 30s, maybe 40s. So it's not like he was not old at all either. Chet, you had your hand up.
It also gives me the assurance that I have a home with God through what Jesus went through and suffered. He made a way for me to be accepted to the will of God.
Yeah, absolutely. This was the substitution there. Oh, sorry. Samantha.
Kind of bouncing off what Zach said, I think it just like shows me like the amount of love Christ had, because there's no way I could go through that.
Yeah, if it was on me for all of you, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I pretty positive I would chicken out at least. Somebody over here, Greg.
A lot has been said over the years and decades, a lot of debate about Jesus' statement on the cross, "Why have you forsaken me, God?"
Yeah.
And I think in looking at some of the details of this ordeal, from a purely physical standpoint, the fact that he is the Son of God, he still resisted the urge or resisted the ability to not only relieve his own suffering, he could have lifted himself off that cross. He could have had legions of angels attend to him. He could have leveled the city of Jerusalem. There could have been lots of options. But from the human side of Christ being, I like to say he was 200%, 100% God, 100% man.
Yeah.
The 100% man of Christ was abandoned on the cross. And there's no sugarcoating that. And these elements, I think, reinforce that this was not something to be faced lightly or flippantly. This
Yeah.
was very, very much the worst thing he could have endured in this world.
And I think you see that reflected in the garden, where he's literally asking, is there some other way? I will do it, but is there some other way?
And not just the physical, but also the mental anguish and the degradation that he suffered. He, as an honored person, was brought to the very lowest, the people mocking him.
Yeah.
And imagine, because he had thoughts and feelings just like we do.
Absolutely.
And thinking of how that would have made him suffer mentally and emotionally
Mhm.
as well as physically.
I think we literally cannot imagine. Yeah.
There's not even possible.
Yeah. Jerry, you had your hand up.
I was just thinking about this assassination was not like a bullet or a rope or a gas.
Yeah.
It was excruciating. It's interesting to me that he lived in an era when crucifixion was the capital offense,
Yeah.
capital punishment. Had he lived in another time, he wouldn't have thought nearly as much about his sacrifice.
Yeah, and we can talk about that in a moment too, but I think too, if you look at the whole of Scripture, the fact that Jesus came when that was the top of capital punishment was on purpose. He became a curse, and what the law says about those things. Joy.
Maybe I'm the only one who would have thought this, but if I were him, I would imagine that I would have said, "You stinking people that I created, how dare you do this to me? I created you."
Yeah.
He did not do that.
And that might be part of what John is talking about in John chapter 1, that he came to his own and his own did not know him. Of course, there could be some other things. One that I pulled also was, we've talked about how contemporary society has really softened the cross, and some people say we put roses all around the cross. And so I hope you can see a little bit more of what the cross meant to the first Christians who were hearing about it. And so then what implications might that have when Jesus tells us things like, pick up your cross and follow me? What kind of demands would that put on us? And you think about all that we've gone through with this, and
That it's sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
It's hard. And he acknowledges that. And you look at everything, and sometimes we think, oh man, that means I gotta, I guess, give up this TV show tonight so I can pick up my cross and go to Bible study. We have, I think, such a small view, if that's the way that we're thinking of things. This is what the cross represents. Joy.
And along with that, that he's not asking us to do something he didn't himself do.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, I'm trying to decide between my questions here. Turn for a second to Galatians chapter 3. I think this is important. Galatians chapter 3, and can somebody read verses 13 and 14 of Galatians chapter 3? Zach, can you do that?
Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith.
Okay, thank you. What is Paul talking about when he says, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree? What is he referring to in this passage? The crucifixion. And so you can see elsewhere in the New Testament that the cross is referred to as the tree, and that was part of how they talked about it. But like we said a few moments ago, the fact that Jesus was crucified was 100% on purpose as far as God is concerned. And why was that, according to what Paul says here? So that he could become what? It's one word. It starts with a C. It rhymes with merce. So that he could become a curse. And so what Paul talks about is that so that he could become a curse, and that in that save people from the curse of the law. And the curse of the law is, not being able to keep it perfectly. And so God intentionally has him die in this way so that he can become that curse and the means of lifting that curse for all of us. And so I say it was completely on purpose that Jesus was crucified and not anything else. And that is just, one passage that we could look at in talking about some of this.
There is a
Yeah.
reference in Deuteronomy 22 of part of the Hebrew law about hanging one on a tree being the curse of one who has committed a sin worthy of death.
Yeah.
So, whereas this is a Roman execution, there's more to it than just that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's some discussion about the Deuteronomy passage, and if you kind of look at the law, some people think that this is, someone was executed for sin under the law, and then their body was displayed by hanging it on a tree. And it was a means of shaming and disgracing them for breaking the law. And so there's all kinds of parallels there, but Paul talks about the fact that it was shameful and it was scandalous. And I don't think we can really fully understand that from our time and culture, what that would have meant for them. That, yeah, this was more than just a crucifixion. This was becoming everything horrible and shameful. Or as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. And so this was the plan all along. Anything else that we want to say about that? I'm going to spare you some of my other questions here. Maybe I'll bring them up later if I decide. But anything else that we're thinking with this? One more thing that I do want to talk about, actually, before I forget it. And let me make sure that my brain is recalling here. It's not what I'm thinking about, but it's also good. Hebrews chapter 12, we'll mention this just quickly. So I'll go ahead and read this real quick. And starting in verse 1 of Hebrews 12, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. And so this is another one that shows that it was on purpose that Jesus became a curse and endured the shame and all of those things, and it was because of what laid ahead. And that's what he was focusing on. What I was thinking of in my brain is, and somebody maybe knows where I'm talking about, where it says, let's run to Jesus who is outside the city. It might not say city. But there's kind of the idea of he was outcast, and so let's run to him, and maybe somebody with a phone can find that. That's what I'm thinking of, and that's your challenge, is to find what in the world I'm talking about. Okay. But while somebody maybe is looking for that, I want to conclude this. So we'll conclude this, and as I said, on Sunday we'll pick up with those details, and I'll hand out fact number 3. So these two quotes in the conclusion, these are historians, academics, and the conclusion is that Jesus was executed under Pontius Pilate is a firm fact of history. And another one says that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. And if you look at that footnote number 5, the person who said that is John Dominic Crossan. Has anyone heard of the Jesus Seminar before? Is that familiar to anyone? So the Jesus Seminar was this group of pretty radical fringe academics that got together and they decided we're going to go throughout all of the Gospels and all the information about Jesus, and we're going to decide what's authentic and what's not authentic. And John Dominic Crossan was one of the organizers of this. And so he's about as radical as you can get. And he says there's nothing more certain than the fact that Jesus was crucified. I think that says a lot. And so what I want us to walk away from with this is that Jesus was absolutely crucified by the Romans and buried in a tomb. That is a firm fact. And that is, as we're looking at these facts, and then we're going to ask, what is the best explanation for all of this? What's the conclusion that we should draw? And that's where we're going. So thank you, everyone, for your participation.